In this video we're going to take a brief break from our theory studies and have a short discussion on ways of organising your practice routine. It's very difficult to make hard and fast rules about this sort of thing. Of course, everybody has a different amount of time available to them to practice. People have different combinations of aptitudes and weaknesses. Something that may be quite easy for you to master could be difficult for somebody else, and vice versa. And not least, everybody has slightly different aims and objectives. If your ambition is to become a virtuoso soloist, then your priorities will be slightly different than if your emphasis is on songwriting perhaps, and you're treating the guitar mainly as an instrument for accompaniment. Similarly, your needs will be different if you're planning to play in a band or if you're aiming to be a solo performer. However, we can offer some general hints and guidelines which you can adopt and adapt to suit your own personal needs. Perhaps the most important thing is to make a plan and stick to it. Of course, your plan can be periodically reviewed and revised. There's no need to be excessively dogmatic about these things. Nevertheless, forming a carefully designed strategy and following it in a systematic and disciplined manner will pay dividends in the long term. The other very important thing is to, as far as possible, practice every day. Little and often is far better than having a massive blitz once a week or twice a week. Needless to say, lots and often is even better, but we don't all have the luxury of that amount of time to spare. Even if you don't have time for your full practice routine on a given day, you should at least try to handle your instrument briefly. Just pick it up in an idle moment and strum out a few chords or pick out a few licks. If you're watching TV by yourself, you keep your guitar with you and noodle away quietly, or run through some mindless finger exercises that don't require any attention or concentration. And that way, even if you're not doing any formal practice, you're still maintaining and building your familiarity with the instrument. Okay, so how do we construct our plan for a practice routine? Well, as I've said, everybody has a different amount of time available, so I would take the time you have and divide it proportionately. I think you should never forget that the ultimate objective is to play music, whether it's for public performance or just for your own enjoyment. So I think a good half of your practice time should be devoted to performance, that's to say practicing pieces that you actually intend to play. Of the remaining time, I think a few minutes, maybe up to a quarter of your practice time, should be dedicated to pure experimentation. Try out your own ideas, try to discover new techniques and new concepts for yourself. And the remaining time can be devoted to your technique exercises. There are an awful lot of technique exercises available to you, so you need to think carefully about how you're going to work your way through them. And one thing I would like to emphasize is that you should try and move on and make progress each day, or at least each 2 or 3 days. Don't feel that you have to fully master a given exercise before you can go on to the next one. This will apply to our chord progression exercises in this series, but is a principle that can also be applied to any sort of technique exercises. For example, if you're working on developing your right hand technique using different picking patterns or different strumming and picking rhythms, then you should take a small set of patterns each day, work on it, and then the next day move on to something new. And when it comes to practicing our chord progressions, there are different ways you can schedule your practice routine. For example, you might like to take a given chord progression and work your way through the keys, practicing in a different key each day. As an alternative, you might like to take one key and practice a different chord progression in that key each day. Later on in this series, we'll be looking at how to relate melodic elements of music to the chord progressions, that is, using arpeggios, pentatonics, scales and modes. When you get to this stage, you might like to explore a given chord progression in depth, perhaps practicing the chords one day, arpeggios the next, scales the next, and so on, before moving on to the same chord progression in a new key, or a new chord progression in the same key. If you're interested in learning to read music, whether in notation or tablature, it's even more important to keep ringing the changes. As soon as you play a piece of music twice, you've begun to play it from memory, and you're no longer fully engaging your reading skills. So if you're really determined to learn to sight read, you should accumulate as large a pile of material as possible so that you can play each piece once and then put it straight back to the bottom of the pile so that you don't come to it again until you've had time to forget it. Finally, I'd like to reiterate a couple of points I made in the earlier video. One is that you can increase the benefit from your practice session by combining left hand and right hand exercises. So as you practice your left hand fingerings, be it chord progressions or scales, arpeggios or whatever, you can use different right-hand techniques at the same time. So you can strum out the chords in different rhythms, or use different picking patterns to play the chords. If you're playing scales, you can play them in single notes, you can play them double time or triple time, and so on and so forth. And finally, a reminder that as you work your way through the chord progressions in different keys, you should try in each new key to find a new chord voicing or combination of voicings, bearing in mind that any chord voicing that doesn't use the open strings can be readily transposed to all the other keys. Okay, hope this has been helpful to you. Just a short session here. In our next video we're going to return to our chord progressions and start looking at the minor key chord progressions in seventh chords. So until then, keep well and goodbye.